Hello and welcome to the Johan Hari podcast. I'm a journalist for the independent newspaper, and each week on this show I try to look for the inconvenient truths buried beneath the headlines, the real news you won't hear elsewhere. And sometimes the most revealing aspect of the shrieking babble of the 24/7 news agenda is the silence. Often the most important facts are just hiding beneath the noise, unmentioned and undiscussed. So the fact that Dominique Strauss-Kahn, the former head of the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, is facing trial for allegedly raping a maid in a New York hotel room is, quite rightly, big news. But imagine a prominent figure was charged not with raping a maid, but starving her to death along with her children, her parents, and thousands of other people. That's what the IMF has done to innocent people in the recent past. That's what it's going to do again, unless we transform it beyond all recognition. But that is being left in the silence. So to understand this story, you have to reel right back to the birth of the IMF. In 1944, the countries that were poised to win the Second World War gathered in a hotel in rural New Hampshire to divvy up the spoils. With a few honourable exceptions, like the great British economist John Maynard Keynes, the negotiators were determined to do one thing. They wanted to build a global financial system that ensured the money and resources of the planet were forever being hoovered towards them. They set up a series of institutions designed for that purpose, and so the IMF was delivered into the world. The IMF's official job sounds simple and pretty attractive. It's supposedly there to ensure that poor countries don't fall into debt, and if they do, to lift them out with loans and economic expertise. It's presented as the poor world's best friend and guardian. But beyond the rhetoric, the IMF was really designed to be dominated by a handful of rich countries, and more specifically, by their bankers and financial speculators. The IMF works in their interests every step of the way. And you've got to look at how this plays out on the ground. I'll give you one example to start with. In the 1990s, the small country of Malawi, which is in southeastern Africa, was facing severe economic problems. They had one of the worst HIV epidemics in the world, and they had just survived a really horrific dictatorship. They had to ask the IMF for help. Now, if the IMF acted on its official role, it would have given loans and guided the country to develop in the same way that Britain and the US and every other successful country had developed, by protecting its infant industries, subsidising its farmers, and investing in the education and health of its people. That's what an institution that was concerned with ordinary people and accountable to them would look like. But the IMF did something really different. They said they would only give assistance if Malawi agreed to the structural adjustments the IMF demanded. They ordered Malawi to sell off almost everything the state owned to private companies and speculators, and to slash spending on the population. They demanded, for example, they stop subsidising fertiliser, even though it was the only thing that made it possible for farmers, who are most of the population, to grow anything in the country's feeble and depleted soil. They told them to prioritise giving money to international bankers over giving money to the Malawian people. So, when in 2001 the IMF found out the Malawian government had built up large stockpiles of grain in case there was a crop failure, they ordered them to sell it off to private companies at once. They told Malawi to get their priorities straight and use the proceeds to pay off a loan from a big bank the IMF had told them to take out in the first place at a 56% annual rate of interest. The Malawian president protested and said this was really dangerous, but he didn't have much choice. The grain was sold. The banks were paid. And then, the next year, the crops failed. And now the Malawian government had almost nothing to hand out. The starving population was reduced to eating the bark off the trees and any rats they could capture. The BBC described it as Malawi's worst ever famine. There had been a much worse crop failure in 1991-2, but there was no famine then because the government had grain stocks to distribute. So at least 1,000 innocent people starved to death. At the height of the starvation, the IMF suspended $47 million in aid because the government had slowed in implementing the marketeering reforms that had led to the disaster. ActionAid, the leading provider of help on the ground, conducted an autopsy into the famine, and they concluded that the IMF, quote, bears responsibility for the disaster, end quote. Then, in the starved wreckage, Malawi did something poor countries are not supposed to do, something they are intimidated into not doing by all Western governments. They told the IMF to get the hell out of their country. Suddenly, they were free to answer to their own people rather than foreign bankers. So Malawi disregarded all the IMF's advice and brought back subsidies for the fertiliser, along with a range of other services to ordinary people. Within 2 years, the country was transformed from being a beggar to being so abundant they were supplying food aid to Uganda and Zimbabwe. The Malawian famine should have been a distant warning cry for you and for me. Subordinating the interests of ordinary people to bankers and speculators caused starvation there. Within a few years, it had crashed the global economy here. In the history of the IMF, this story is not an exception. It's the rule. The organisation takes over poor countries, promises it has medicine that will cure them, and then pours poison down their throats. Whenever I travel across the poor parts of the world, I see the scars from IMF structural adjustments everywhere, from Peru to Ethiopia. Whole countries have collapsed after being IMF'd up, most famously Argentina and Thailand in the 1990s. Just look at some of the organisation's greatest hits for a taste of this. In Kenya, the IMF insisted the government introduce fees to see the doctor, so the number of women seeking help or advice on STDs fell by 65% in one of the countries worst affected by AIDS in the world. In Ghana, the IMF insisted the government introduce fees for going to school, and the number of rural families who could afford to send their kids crashed by 2/3. In Zambia, the IMF insisted they slash health spending, and the number of babies who died doubled. Amazingly enough, it turns out that shoveling your country's money to foreign bankers rather than your own people is not a great development strategy. The Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz worked really closely with the IMF for over a decade until he quit and became a whistleblower. He told me a few years ago, quote, "When the IMF arrives in a country, they're interested in only one thing. How do we make sure the banks and financial institutions get paid? It's the IMF that keeps the financial speculators in business. They're not interested in development or what helps a country to get out of poverty." End quote. Some people call the IMF inconsistent because the institution supports huge state-funded bank bailouts in the rich world while demanding an end to almost all state funding in the poor world. But that's only an inconsistency if you're thinking about the realm of intellectual ideas rather than raw economic interests. In every situation, the IMF does what will get more money to bankers and speculators. If rich governments will hand banks money for nothing in bailouts, great. If poor countries can be forced to hand money in extortionate repayments, great. It's absolutely consistent. Now, some people claim that Dominique Strauss-Kahn was a reformer who changed the IMF after he took over in 2009. Certainly, there was a shift in rhetoric, but detailed studies by Dr. Daniela Gabor of the University of the West of England have shown that the substance amounted to business as usual. Look, to pluck one example, at Hungary. After the 2008 crash, the IMF lauded them for keeping to their original deficit target by slashing public services. The horrified Hungarian people responded by kicking the government out and choosing a party that promised to make the banks pay for the crisis they had created. So the Hungarian government introduced a 0.7% levy on the banks, which is 4 times higher than anywhere else. The IMF went apeshit. They said this was highly distortive for banking activity, unlike the bailouts, of course, and shrieked that it would cause the banks to flee from the country. The IMF shut down their entire Hungary program to intimidate them. But the collapse predicted by the IMF didn't happen. So Hungary kept on pursuing really sensible moderate measures. Instead of punishing their own people, they imposed taxes on the hugely profitable sectors of retail, energy and telecoms, and took funds from private pensions to pay the deficit. The IMF shrieked at every step and demanded cuts for ordinary Hungarians instead. Yep, this was the same old agenda with the same old threats. Dominique Strauss-Kahn did the same in almost all the poor countries where the IMF operated, from El Salvador to Pakistan to Ethiopia, where big cuts in subsidies for ordinary people have been imposed. Plenty have been intimidated into harming their own interests. The US-based think tank, the Center for Economic and Policy Research, crunched the numbers and they found that 31 of the 41 IMF agreements under Strauss-Kahn required pro-cyclical macroeconomic policies. That is, ones that push them into deeper recession. So, it's not only Dominique Strauss-Kahn who should be on trial.